But first, there are many ridiculous things about the United Nations. Remember how Iran sponsored, financed and trained terrorists who committed the October 7 attacks on Israel? Well, just 3 weeks later, Iran was appointed the chair of the UN Human Rights Forum, a position which should be so incompatible with reality that no sane-minded person would ever endorse this. But apparently, there are very few at the UN who are sane of mind. The United States complained about the move, but it was overruled due to the absurd setup of the UN. The meeting went ahead in Geneva anyway, but it didn't get that much media attention at all. And then this week, the UN sent its so-called expert, Francesca Albanese, to Australia to lecture us about the Israeli-Hamas conflict.
With your permission, I will clarify what is self-defense under international law, and so that everyone can understand, well, there is not such a thing that Israel could claim. So, in common language, self-defense might be understood as the right to protect oneself. But however, Article 51 of the UN Charter that Israel has invoked is not just the right to protect itself. It's a self-defense under international law. It's a legal term of art and means the right to wage a war, which Israel doesn't have. And this is consolidated jurisprudence of the supreme judicial organ of the United Nations.
Truly crazy stuff. Not only did she repeatedly minimise the crimes of Hamas, she set out a legal framework for why Israel was wrong to respond. You see, Albanese, who was supposed to be an impartial observer and an advocate for the region, made the case that Israel is an occupier, therefore has no jurisdiction for retaliation. This woman is dangerous, and the fact the UN props her up and our National Press Club books her as a speaker is absolutely insane. And even the project's Walid Ali appeared stunned later in an interview with Albanese.
But again, we are talking of the people that Israel occupies, and it has occupied for 56 years now.
Sorry, so to be clear, are you saying Israel should have asked the United Nations to send in its own force to demilitarize Gaza and to remove the military capacity from Hamas, and that the United Nations would have undertaken that task?
Well, look, there have been other cases, including in Europe. I often cite the case of the Bataclan. The Bataclan was the most tragic and deadly terrorist attack that France has ever suffered, the greatest attack since the Second World War on its own territory. It emanated from a terrorist group in Belgium. Has France resorted to bomb entire civilian neighborhoods in Belgium? No.
Gaza is not occupied. The people democratically elected Hamas and they govern themselves. That is a fact. And is Albanese seriously contrasting the situation of Belgium terror cell with Hamas? Hamas controls Gaza. It was elected. The two incidents are not comparable in any way. And while the media for the most part saw through the words of this anti-Israeli activist, some were actually celebrating her message. Writer Sahar Adacia wrote, Israel cannot claim the right of self-defense against a threat that emanates from the territory it occupies, one under belligerent occupation. And then, of course, The Guardian's Amy Ramikas was equally as doe-eyed over the speaker. If you are not watching Francesca Albanese deliver the National Press Club address, I implore you to turn it on. Not only were Albanese's comments appalling and widely condemned by the Jewish community, they were actually fundamentally revealing. Her speech showed why the UN legitimizes extremist viewpoints. Albanese does not seem to think Israel has the right to save its people who have been taken hostage. And for some in the media to cheer that notion on is just sickening. Well, let's bring in the panel, and joining me on the show is the Sky News host, Caroline DeRusso, and Nova Radio's Michelle Stevenson. Michelle, thanks for joining us on the desk. I don't know if you caught that press club performance.
Oh, yes, I did.
But wasn't it quite something?
It was quite something. I don't think there's been a press club performance more so that I've wanted to throw things at the television. I found what she was saying, not only was she incredibly condescending to the people who were asking legitimate questions, she was making up stuff that appeared pure lie and speculation. escalation. I think what we need to do is take the emotion out of this conversation. She was incredibly emotional, she was incredibly reactive, and that's not what you need from someone who's representing the UN and trying to sort out what is going on in this situation. We need people who are clinical, people who see it from both sides, and she clearly has a bias here, and clearly that was showing and on point. And what I did not like was other members of the community, of the journalistic community, jumping on the bandwagon. Like, I know that this is really hard to watch. I know that there's a lot of bad stuff going on here, but what we need to do is we need to really take that emotion out. We need to see it for what it is. I mean, if we look at what happened in Afghanistan after September 11th, the Americans stormed Afghanistan. 70,000 civilians were killed in that war. Where was the outrage? Where were the people taking to the streets? For some reason, this war has really struck a chord with people, and people are choosing a side, and I think we really need to be a bit more measured about it.
Yeah, and just picking up on that point, Caroline, the United Nations, obviously it is fractured. There's various spokespeople that say contrasting things. But in this situation, the person who's representing the UN has quite clearly picked a side. And the thing that was disturbing to me was that many in our media appeared to celebrate that. They appeared to be euphoric at the ideas that were coming from this person who was not being objective.
No, and you can criticise Israel's behaviour without accepting every single position that is anti-Israel. And I think that's where, people need to be very careful. This here is not, just one side or the other, and it is not if you accept one view on one side that you accept all the views, no matter how extreme they are, on that particular side. And I think that there is something that is incredibly troubling. Yet, by all means, you can criticise both sides, but there are issues on both sides, and there are civilians, obviously, in danger on both sides. The comment for me about the UN demilitarising Hamas was so ridiculous. If it wasn't so serious, it would be hilarious. I mean, at this point, the UN can't even stop Hamas pilfering their fuel, and they're somehow going to demilitarise the Gaza Strip. I mean, it is just so fanciful. I cannot believe that people who represent the UN are able to say these sorts of things without any sort of consequence. Are there no guidelines? Are there no protocols for the way that they conduct themselves in an international audience? Because that there does reflect back to the UN. I find that absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, it's a great point. And you saw Waleed Ali's face.
Yeah.
And he is massive supporter of Israel, Michelle, is he?
No.
And he looks at this question. He's like, are you suggesting you're going to send in UN investigators who are going to solve it all? My concerns with that would be that, I mean, quite clearly from her perspective, Israel should clear out. They're an occupier. They don't belong there, and Israel shouldn't exist. So what on earth would an investigator that takes that policy approach do in that situation?
Yeah, and we all know that UN investigators barely find anything. I mean, they could barely find, weapons of mass destruction. They can't find, any kind of links to COVID. Who knows what those investigators are actually finding? Look, I think what we need to also take into account is it seemed to be like it was a huge press tour, like she was promoting some kind of book, and yet she hated the press in the same sentence. Like I saw her do on AM Agenda. She was speaking with Peter Stefanovic, and she was incredibly dismissive, failed to answer any of the legitimate questions that he was asking. So Pete
was brilliant.
And Pete was brilliant.
He's been a war correspondent, so
I know,
he knows what he's talking about.
He knows what he's talking about. He held his calm and he held the line, but it was really hard because she seemed to just come back with word salad. Like, none of it seemed to be making sense. And also, can we please just acknowledge, which I feel like she never really did acknowledge, that Hamas is a terrorist group. This is a terrorist group. Yeah. They committed atrocities.
She contrasted it with Belgium. That to me was the most extraordinary thing. She's like, well, in Belgium they sent in the police. Yes, and Gaza and Belgium are not the same.
Yes, and not to mention, like, Hamas have said flat out they will not stop until all Jews are dead.
Yeah, so you have to trust them on that. It's
and she's
harder.
calling for peace with Hamas. Like, it's not making sense to me.